Much for joining the Kirwan Forum series for today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Anja Marie Hancock. I'm the Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute. And today we are having a 100% online session to talk about the new book, Ground Truths, Community Engaged Research for Environmental Justice. And we are honored to have the three co-authors of the book join us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a brief introduction of each of the authors. I'll do them all at once and then leave them to kind of present their work. And then for those of you who are new to our forum series, generally what we do is we have 30 to 45 minutes of presentation. And then we spend about another 30 minutes or so on Q&A. So we do ask folks to use the Q&A function on your Zoom. So it's at the bottom of your screen, and it is the third icon from the right. So if you go, you'll see more closed captioning, and then you'll see Q&A directly to the left of the show captions icon. So you can use that to put any questions. Feel free to put the questions in as you're thinking of them. You don't have to wait until the presentation is over. But without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce someone I've known, I think, almost 20 years now. The first co-author I'm going to introduce is Martha Matsuoka, friend and colleague, and she focuses her teaching and research on community-based organizing and social movements for environmental justice, particularly in planning and policy. Since 2015, she has served as the executive director of the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute, the applied community-based research and program at the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy. At OXI, at the Occidental College, I believe. Her work in community-based research draws on work with a wide range of NGOs, including the ECR Communities for Environmental Justice, Asian Pacific Environmental Network, the Urban Habitat Program, the Liberty Hill Foundation, the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation, and the International Women's Network Against Militarism. She currently serves on the board of Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, which is a multiracial, multi-faith organization working for the dignity and full inclusion of immigrants and people impacted by incarceration. Our second presenter is Chad Raphael, and he is a professor of communication at Santa Clara University, also in California. And he consults on communication campaigns for environmental organizations and has chaired the boards of two environmental justice organizations, the Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation and the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition. He's also a design team member of the Clean Electronics Production Network and a member of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities Laudato Si', not sure if I'm saying that right, commission. Chad is co-editor and co-author of the book. And that book has grown out of an earlier guide that he wrote for the initiative. He's also published a research agenda for community-engaged communications research on environmental justice. His prior research on political communication encompasses environmental communication, news and politics, deliberative democracy, and games for civic learning. He has frequently co-authored articles with undergraduate students. Chad has also chaired the communications department and committees that design Santa Clara's core curriculum and helped draft the university's strategic plan. And he led a task force on greening the International Communication Association. And our last presenter and co-author is Ryan Pettaway. And Ryan thinks Anova G would be an interesting choice for a child's name, and that BDP can tell us more about health than TPB. He's probably drinking bougie-fied coffee in the rain right now, going to extreme measures to protect his Griffey Max 1 fresh waters. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our three fantastic co-presenters, and welcome again to the Kirwan Forum series, the three of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Hancock and the Kirwan Institute of the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. It's not remiss on us that, we're zooming in from other places, but recognizing sort of the power and the relevance of speaking to you all, many of whom you might be in Ohio, we're assuming. Dr. Hancock was sharing with us earlier that Ohio is one of the largest polluters in the world. And we think that helped ground us, I think, to think about why this book might be relevant today. We're very aware of the history of the environmental injustice in Ohio, and also, the organizing that's emerging and has been fighting back against tremendous odds. We're here also on a day that's Halloween, so happy Halloween, you all. For us in California, or in Los Angeles in particular, it's a big day post the World Series. So it's and we're on the kind of the cusp of an election, and so there's tremendous amount of challenges in the world right now. So it feels like a particularly relevant context that we're talking about all of our work today. So thank you so much. I also want to thank Maritza Pierre for all the wonderful support, all things logistics and technological. So thank you, Maritza. So I wanted to thank you, Anne-Marie, for that really wonderful presentation. Let me just go to the next slide and start us off here. Today, Chad and Ryan and I want to present sort of an arc of the book, but also focus on some specific aspects of the book that we think might be relevant for the talk today. So I'll start with a brief overview of the goals of the book. Chad will follow with a description of the book's contents and main argument. Then Ryan will present on community engaged research, EJ, race, and public health, based on some of the work he did around research methods and his chapter on public health. And we look forward to addressing your questions and discussions after our presentations, encouraging folks both to drop questions into the webinar question and answer, the icons there at the bottom of your screen, as well as downloading the book. That QR code will take you directly to our book, which is an ebook free. So please download. So next slide. In our talk, we all describe the goals and contents, discuss reasons why a community engaged research approach is especially valuable for EJ. We also want to address the limitations of the approach and when it might not be appropriate. Okay, so when Chad came to me and said, let's write a book, we talked about the different goals of the book. And so I want to share a few of those with you. First goal was to focus specifically on community engaged research for environmental justice. We knew that there were many excellent books on community engaged research and also about environmental justice already written, but no single volume that synthesized the community engaged approach with environmental justice. We also wanted to focus on our primary audience of professional researchers, whether researchers in academia, government, advocacy organizations, some of them work or have worked as researchers in community organizations. It was a particular audience, but we knew there were excellent resources available that had been written by community partners for a community level audience, and our role was to speak to the professional researchers to do more and to do better. Secondly, we wanted to demonstrate how community engaged research advances environmental justice, and we see this in 4 ways. The first is centering local knowledge, building truth from the ground up, producing actionable data that can influence decisions, and transforming researchers' relationships to communities for equity and mutual benefit. Our third goal was to establish a justice framework on how community engaged research and EJ align on concepts of justice. Chad will talk a little bit more about this in the next part of the presentation, but we were really interested in how concepts of justice apply in various fields of urban planning, public health, conservation, law and policy, community economic development, and food justice and sovereignty. Our fourth goal was to involve multiple perspectives and fields. Chad and I brought our own experiences and disciplinary perspectives to the book project, and we recognize that knowledge is situated in individual perspectives and experience, and also produced through relations with others, because anyone can contribute to research, but no one can produce it alone. We knew that we needed additional perspectives beyond our own and more collective authorship, so we reached out to early career Black, Indigenous, and scholars of color who are doing community engaged research in their respective fields and invited them to co-author chapters with us. And we're thrilled that Ryan's here today to contribute his to the book. Also to note, we wanted to create a book that was widely accessible. So we opted for an ebook downloadable for free. There again is the QR code. So those are the goals of the book. We organized the book in 3 chunks. The first was two chapters that set the foundation for the book. No surprise, the first chapter is around environmental justice, where we explore the definition of the term, some movement history, and also extensive literature review on the field of scholarship. The second chapter is on community engaged research. There's many names for it: participatory action research, as you know, citizen science, community science, indigenous-led and decolonial research, etc. And we pulled in literature to cover not just the things that have been published about community engaged research that included journal articles, but many other different sources. Gray literature to white papers, policies to posters, plays, poetry, music, maps to marketing campaigns, etc. It was a wide kind of look at what we think community engaged research really represents. The second chunk of the book really focuses on what we call collaborations, basically the elements of community engaged research. The first, chapter 3, focuses on preparing for community engaged research. This is the chapter that looks at the individual level, project-related level, disciplinary and institutional levels of how researchers need to prepare for community engaged research. The fourth chapter looks at the community engaged process itself, right? How do we start asking questions? How do we engage with community partners? What does the research process look like from start to finish? And how does it circle back to our relationships with our partners? The third piece of this section has to do with how to transform academia for community engaged research. It was very clear to us and our authors that academic institutions needed to do much more to support scholars and academic researchers to actually do community engaged research, for tenure policies, for incentives, etc. Okay. And the third part of the book really focuses on what we call applications. And here's where we had amazing young scholars tell us how they're using community engaged research. Ryan wrote it with his co-author, led the effort around research methods and methodologies. I think he's going to talk about that today. We had a chapter around how community engaged research shows up for law, policy, regulation, and public participation for EJ. The next chapter thought about community economic development, public health, which Ryan will cover, food justice and food sovereignty, urban and regional planning, and conservation. So let me turn it over to my friend and co-editor, Chad, to talk about why community engaged research for environmental justice.
Thank you so much, Martha. I feel so fortunate to have worked with you and with Ryan and all of our collaborators. To write this book during the dark days of the pandemic. This was one of the things that really helped me to get through that very difficult time, to show up with each of you on Zoom and talk about chapters and how they were developing was something that gave me a motivation to keep working and keep looking towards the future. I'm going to focus on the book's argument initially for why community engaged research as an approach to research makes so much sense when we're doing environmental justice research. And the two main arguments that we make here are that community engaged research makes a unique contribution to environmental justice, not just environmental justice research, but environmental justice itself, because a CER approach advances justice through the research process, not just the outcomes, not just the findings, not just what we do with those findings, how we implement them, but the very process itself is a contribution to justice. And that's because environmental justice is served best when communities exercise power, the power to co-produce and to control their own knowledge, to inform and influence decisions that affect those residents. That's been a key theme of the environmental justice movement in the United States from the beginning. this is such a beautiful and powerful quote from Vernice Miller Travis, who was one of the co-founders of West Harlem Environmental Action, or We Act for EJ, one of the kind of groundbreaking EJ groups in America. Looking back on that time from about 2 decades later, she said, "We gave birth to a conversation that people would recognize as their own. We gave it a language. We gave it words. We gave it a science base. We gave it a public policy base. And we gave it a base that was rooted in the power and mobilization of people on the ground, so it couldn't be denied." So that's her looking back at the founding of the movement in these kind of biblical terms, right? I mean, think Book of Genesis here, right? And talking about, from a very kind of community engaged research perspective, why that is so powerful, because it grounds research in the power and mobilization of people on the ground so that it can't be denied. In the book, we lay out how community engaged research and environmental justice as a movement and as a field of scholarship share complementary visions of justice. And we look at that complementary across 4 dimensions of justice. The distributive justice, procedural justice, recognition, and transformational justice. So let me start with how they complement each other with distributive justice, which is about who ought to get what. In the environmental justice movement, distributive justice is about reducing environmental burdens and increasing environmental benefits and capabilities for EJ communities that have been denied them for so long, but also for other nature. The EJ movement is not exclusively an anthropomorphic or people-only movement. In community engaged research, distributed justice, similarly, is about sharing of resources and work among community-based researchers and academic researchers. It drives a movement to develop the community's capacities to conduct their own research and researchers' capacities to collaborate well with communities, because we have to unlearn a bunch of stuff we learned in graduate school about how to actually collaborate well with real people in real communities. And often it involves co-ownership or community ownership of data. Those are all distributive justice issues. It's also about procedural justice. So in the EJ movement, and these questions about who ought to make decisions. In the EJ movement, a key theme has been that EJ communities should participate and influence in environmental decisions that historically excluded groups, especially those living in frontline EJ communities, have a right to participate and influence and help determine decisions about what happens in their communities. And those decisions should end up protecting individual and group rights through new laws, regulations, the enforcement of them, and informed consent for research as well. In the community engaged research tradition, procedural justice is about the community participating and influencing the design and conduct of research, the research agenda, what gets studied, who gets to be involved in doing that. And it also includes free and prior informed consent to do that research in those communities and those communities' rights to control data about themselves. Recognition justice is about whose knowledge and culture should be respected and valued in public discourse. So in the environmental justice tradition, there's been a long emphasis on respecting EJ communities' diverse environmental cultures and knowledges, local knowledge, experiential knowledge, indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, and also for the interests of future generations and more than human nature. On the community engaged research tradition side, recognition justice has been about decolonizing knowledge by recognizing the validity and the differences. And those differences are important too, right? The validity and the differences among local and experiential and indigenous knowledges. And then finally, in terms of transformation justice, which is about what ought to change and how, EJ has emphasized the restoration of nature, reparation of damages to EJ communities from centuries of colonialism, racism, economic exploitation, and other systems of oppression, patriarchy, ableism, anti-LGBTQ as well. And it emphasizes systemic and structural transitions that could create more just power relations among us, regenerative economies, and reciprocal relations between humans and nature. CER echoes that commitment to transformation justice. by talking about how we need to transform our own academic and government institutions and the way we do our research, the way we fund it, our research agendas, in order to repair the very real harms that research has done to EJ communities and to create more just relations with EJ communities and with nature. You go around to Black communities in America, people still know about the Tuskegee experiment. You go to Indigenous communities, they're very painfully aware of how archaeologists and medical researchers have stolen ancestors' bones, artifacts, and biological specimens to conduct research without informed consent or benefiting communities. So there's restorative justice to do there as well. The process of community-engaged research, ideally, begins as something that unfolds between academic researchers and communities. It's research that we as academics do with communities rather than research that is done on those communities as a passive object or for them as a kind of client or ward. So ideally, it's a cyclical process that involves shared inquiry and collaboration, beginning with forming partnerships, co-defining goals and research questions, co-designing each element of the research, collaborating to implement interventions like, for example, health or organizing campaigns, and collecting data jointly with community members, analyzing that data together, co-disseminating the results, even if there's a division of labor where academics might do more of the work and disseminating that work in academic fora like journal articles or conferences, although community members get their names on those publications and presentations, and community members taking the lead in presenting that work at neighborhood meetings, in regulatory and political forums, and so on. And then translating those findings into actions. And ideally, this leads to new questions and new interventions for future research partnerships, which deepen the relationships between communities and researchers over time. So we go on to make the argument for why community-engaged research has a unique contribution to make to environmental justice by talking about the 4 R's, the first 3 of which were especially developed by Carolina Balash and Rachel Morella-Frosch in some of their early work, and then also developed particularly by folks in the community-based participatory research tradition that's came out of public health, but has influenced lots of other fields. And that first R has to do with relevance. And that's why it's about how community-engaged research ensures that research asks questions that reflect community priorities, not just academic trends or interests, and arrives at findings that can provide actionable knowledge to communities, that can directly inform policymaking, judicial rulings, community organizing campaigns. Second contribution that community-engaged research can make is to the rigor of the research. Now, rigor is a social construction and a very fraught term. This is something that Ryan in particular, I think, has taught me. And it's often used to assert unreasonable standards of proof of harm from environmental injustices, like exposure to toxic substances. But it's also a very powerful term, and I think it's one we should fight to redefine and reclaim. In some ways, the way progressive movements are trying to redefine and reclaim the word freedom these days. Because community-engaged research can improve study design, and it can improve data collection, and it can improve data analysis by supplementing abstract academic knowledge with community members' local and experiential knowledge of their own neighborhoods, or the traditional ecological knowledge amassed by Indigenous people over centuries. Community partners are often best positioned to identify appropriate research sites and populations, to earn the trust needed to do work with them by promoting deeper community understanding of the research process and confidence in its goals. And in doing so, CER can increase sample sizes and survey and interview response rates and participation in interventions and treatments. Engaged partnerships can also unlock new sources of funding that are needed to conduct complex EJ studies at a time when some funders really prefer now to support collaborative work between community organizations and academic institutions by giving the money to the community partner, not the academics, and having the community partner contract with and choose the academics that they want to work with, which is a great development. So through the process of ground truthing, which gives our book its name, local researchers can also correct and fill in gaps in official knowledge, like government databases and maps. So these are all ways in which the rigor of community-engaged research makes an important contribution. And then, of course, community-engaged research extends the reach of traditional academic research. Community partners bring valuable capacities to disseminate knowledge to diverse audiences and translate it into useful tools for practice and policy and organizing. And that research gets circulated not just through academic venues, but also in policy briefings and white papers, all those things that Martha mentioned at the beginning of our talk. So community partners play a crucial role in building active audiences for research by translating it into local languages and lay terms, promoting and applying its findings, and implementing findings or demanding responses from decision makers. And then finally, the fourth R, which has been maybe talked about less, has to do with reflexivity. And that's how CER helps researchers, particularly academic researchers, to practice greater reflexivity about the nature and purposes of their research, about power relations within research teams, and whose interests the research ultimately serves. Reflexivity emerges from common CER practices of organizing community review boards to craft research agendas and vet project proposals, drafting detailed memoranda of understanding among partners, holding co-learning workshops to explore the meaning of rigor and validity from researcher and from community points of view, and ongoing dialogue and conflict resolution at each stage of the work. And then finally, we also argue that community-engaged research is especially important now at this historical moment. We live in a time, obviously, of growing misinformation and declining public trust, especially among EJ communities in traditional institutions that have produced knowledge, academia, the mass media, government. And so one of the wonderful things about community-engaged research is that community people who are involved in research are a lot more likely to believe it and a lot more likely to act on their findings because they are their findings, not just some experts, than if they're passive recipients of expert knowledge. This is such a powerful shift in people's orientation towards knowledge. And that's because experience is often the best teacher, if it's the experience of doing rigorous, careful, systematic, meaningful research in collaboration with others. Because we also know that experiences, cannot be a great teacher, but this kind of experience can be. And then secondly, it's crucial now that we do community-engaged research in order to communicate about EJ and communicate those findings. And this has to do with studies on source credibility, for example, in climate justice research. The wonderful thing about community-engaged research, it's the story of environmental justice that people tell themselves and their communities. When they do that, that knowledge becomes testimony. It becomes testimony from people like us to people like us who've done community-engaged research themselves. And that is also a very, very powerful teacher. So at this point, you might be wondering, maybe I don't do community-engaged research or I haven't done it yet. Are these people telling me that community-engaged research is the only legitimate approach to EJ research, and the work that I'm doing and other people are doing that doesn't involve CER is not legitimate? And the answer is no. We are not saying that CER is the only legitimate approach to EJ research. There are some limitations to when CER can be used. It's not the only valuable kind of research because a lot of kinds of research can contribute to our understanding and our advancing of environmental justice. And some of that kind of research can be necessary prep work in order to build academic researchers' understanding of a topic or an area and community partners' trust that academic researchers know and care enough about the issues that community partners, frankly, already know are facing their community, that they're worth collaborating with. So literature reviews and scoping studies and all of those kind of traditional sorts of research can be valuable preparatory steps. And then finally, not all situations are ripe for CER collaborations. In some communities or among some researchers, there may be a lack of awareness of environmental justice or a lack of commitment to collaborate. There may be intolerable risks to community partners or researchers' health and safety by conducting this kind of research in highly polarized kinds of communities. And then there are communities that have research fatigue, that are tired of being studied. Particularly indigenous communities, or that have very high levels of mistrust, usually for very good reason, of researchers who've come into their community in the past. Or there's a lack of representative organizations that outside researchers could collaborate with. Or the community prefers to delegate that research to others because they trust them. They've already worked with them. Or they can do that research without involving outside researchers at all. And again, there are increasingly sophisticated EJ organizations that are quite capable of doing their own research and don't need people from academia coming in to help them. But maybe the question, given the value of CER for EJ, maybe the question that we should ask ourselves isn't why should we use CER, but why shouldn't we? Maybe that should be our starting point. Because of the reasons that we've mentioned here, because of the unique contribution to environmental justice that CER can make by advancing justice through the research process itself, because CER can best serve environmental justice by facilitating communities' exercise of power to co-produce, co-control their own knowledge, because of its ability to increase the relevance, the reach, the rigor, and the reflexivity of that research, and to overcome misinformation and mistrust of research. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan now and stop sharing my screen and invite him to share his and talk about the methods work and the public health work.
Thanks for that. Hopefully everyone can see my screen and hear me. I am Dr. Ryan Pettaway. I'm an associate professor and social epidemiologist in the School of Public Health out here in Portland. In addition to loving coffee, as was mentioned in the intro, and my Griffies, I love music and poetry. And so before I get into what I'm going to talk about, I want to put this up on your screen for you to scan and have yourself a little soundtrack for this talk, A Litany for Refusal, inspired by Audre Lorde's poem, A Litany for Survival, particularly the quote, "For it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive." I think in the context of environmental justice research, community engaged or otherwise, oftentimes what we're talking about is continued resistance, and oftentimes the need to move towards refusal for futures, right? To not have to continuously defend our communities from the insults of environmental injustice. And so the photo you see on your screen is from an area I grew up in Eastern Ohio. I went to high school, middle school in Steubenville, Ohio. So some of you remember the Six City Studies, which in many ways has served as an impetus for environmental regulations for air quality, air pollution in the U.S. And so some of you are probably joining us from Ohio, I'm assuming, because of the Kirwan Institute. And so I think that for me, I have lived and embodied some of these stories my entire life. And I think it's important for us to remember the ways in which some of these stories have been told have continued to harm communities. And so what I'm going to talk about is the two chapters I worked on with my colleagues and collaborators, Dr. Sarah Commodore at Indiana University and Dr. David Brevenow, a homie down at SF State, talking about some of the things in public health from where I'm situated as I see community engaged research for environmental justice, and then also some of the methods that I think are more aligned with a future practice of EJ research that does more to center decolonial anti-racist practices. So overview, I'm going to go through these first portions pretty quickly just to give you a bit of a narrative arc about the two chapters that I contributed to with my co-authors, and then get into some examples that I think really illustrate some of the methods and some of the spirit of anti-racism and decolonial practices for environmental research or environmental justice research. So let's go through this. So I think it's important just to touch on this real quick that Chad pointed out already. I think that I can't see what's going on in the chat, so if there's something that y'all can't hear or see, then somebody should just hop on. I think for me, what's important is this idea of procedural and recognition, or epistemic justice, as I refer to it. How we do our work and whose knowledge becomes centered or a part of the story arc. Oftentimes, I think in our communities, Black and Brown communities at the various other margins, it's an outside researcher coming in and telling stories about us without us, right? That phrase. And even in the context of community engaged research, sometimes those stories are done with good intentions and even done by Black and Brown folks who might even be from those communities themselves, but they're so damage centered. And sometimes in the context of environmental justice, to right some of these wrongs, we have to prove the wrongs. And we're really good at showing the damage and the harm. this idea of damage-centered narratives that decolonial feminist scholar Eve Tuck talks about, and Bell Hooks, Black feminist scholars talked about this, the ways in which the structures and systems that created our precarity, created the damage, want to only hear back our stories of how we've been harmed and what our damage is. And so what I really wanted to be specific about within the chapters that my authors and co-authors contributed to was how can we think about environmental justice research going forward in a way that allows us to push back on the harms of environmental injustice, but also surface other narratives of well-being and harm or love and resistance. So this idea of procedural and epistemic justice is really important for the things I'm about to communicate. So for the public health chapter that Dr. Revenant and I contributed to, we wanted to lift up this idea that public health is not new to community engaged work at all. Theoretically, and even on some level, practically, it is all about community engagement. Now, the extent of that community engagement, the depth of that community engagement, the intentions and the rationale for that community engagement, of course, has been problematic various times, including what Chad mentioned earlier regarding Tuskegee. There's also like other various things that our federal government or state governments, local governments have done to cause essentially public health violence upon communities as part of their daily practice, right? And have avoided scrutiny for the most part, right? But there are a set of guidelines that are essential for public health practice and public health services, and they have been updated as of 2020 to center equity. And this is a fantastic thing for the field, of course, but what David and I, Dr. Revenant and I wanted to note in our chapter was that they still don't really mention some of these core things about power imbalances. They don't talk about power necessarily. They don't talk about anti-racism or decolonization, right? So it's still very much a surface level type of orientation, right? There's not a whole lot here, there, right? Something else that we want to lift up regarding public health is that community-engaged research for EJ can take various forms and various methodological and conceptual orientations. I think for public health, a lot of folks would agree that community-based participatory research has been that thing. And to the extent that most folks that think about environmental justice research that's tied to health often think about CVPR, or oftentimes Phil Brown and colleagues' work from the mid-90s, popular epidemiology, right? My entry point to public health was through CVPR and the work, for example, that my advisor and mentor at UC Berkeley, Dr. Richard Murillo-Frosch, was leading regarding air pollution in certain parts of her research, right? So I think that we wanted to name that, bring that in, because I think it has played a significant role for the broader field of environmental justice work, whether it's CER or not. Something that myself and David are also keen on doing is from our positions as we connect to the field of EJ and community-engaged research. We are trained as social epidemiologists and specifically place health scholars, and I'll get to that in a second. But social epidemiology is probably the field in subfield within public health that is probably most attuned to these broader social structural things that often create the context under which we're concerned about environmental exposures to begin with, right? And so if there is an environmental injustice in communities, it's going to be tied to some structural form of inequality or oppression, right? And so it could be class related. It's often class, it's often gendered, it's often racialized, it's often like tied to multiple forms of structural exclusion and oppression, right? And social epidemiology is that field in public health that theoretically and methodologically and empirically is most attuned to unpacking those relationships. And so for David and I to be able to write this chapter, we want to be cautious because it was a lot, social is so broad, also CPR is so broad, and also CER is so broad. We didn't want to like say that this is the only thing, but that's where we were coming from. So we want to be clear about that arc, about how we approach the work and how we wanted to situate it within a broader discourse of public health. And as I mentioned, we're both place health scholars. So something I think that often doesn't get named as explicitly as maybe it should within the broader public health field is when we're talking about environmental justice work and community engaged research. Oftentimes for public health researchers, we're trained to like first pick a research question and then choose methods to answer the research question. And I think that as a place health scholar, what I'm most thinking about is what are the power dynamics in this place and who has influence over what's going on in this place. And then I want to start thinking about what types of data or evidence might be influential for those folks. And then what types of storytelling can we involve within our research methods to persuade those folks, right? And so it's almost the opposite order of how I think traditional public health scholars are trained, right? And I'll say this on the record here, it's being recorded, you can quote me on it, or just play the clip back. I think that when we think that we can just find a good research question and then we can do good research and solve the problem, I think that's bullshit. And so for me to be social epi trained, but also understand that like that form of research is actually not going to get the job done. At the end of the day, we have to be thinking more about power relations that are embedded within very socially, politically located, spatially places, right? What are those power relations, right? If we have data that is expansive and across multiple political jurisdictions, how can we actually use that in one specific place, right? And so for me, there's always this tension between the traditional thinkings of community engaged research within public health, and then how can we improve upon that to be more place focused and power focused and policy and political focus within EJ research. With the understanding that certain exposures like air pollution, for example, aren't going to be in one neighborhood, it's going to be more expansive than that. So maybe you are thinking more broad, but there are certain times where it's just a neighborhood thing, or maybe it's just a few neighborhoods. And so how can we think about our work as tied to those power relations from the very beginning and not be so lost in the research question and getting the best methods to answer that research question? So key to some of this the work within particularly the public health chapter was David and I thinking kind of out loud about the ways in which anti-racist and decolonizing praxis doesn't have like a strong foothold quite yet in the field, and we think that's very important for us to go forward. I think that for us, public health critical race praxis came up for us quite a bit, and these principles of voice, disciplinary self-critique, social construction of knowledge, and intersectionality. Within the EJ work, there is some work and there's some growing body of work on intersectionality, particularly as it relates to exposures and synergisms and things of that nature. But a lot more to be done in this area. And also, I think this idea of disciplinary self-critique is important, right? As I just mentioned, I critique the idea that we have to choose a research question and lead with that, right? I think we should be leading with power relations and then going backwards. That's what I think. And so I think there's got to be room for that critique. Otherwise, we have to ask ourselves, like, what are we really doing here, right? If we've been doing this for so long, is it working? And is it working for every community? Or do we need to think about how we can just do a bit more, right? I think we should always be holding these questions in our minds as we move forward. And then also unsettling research power dynamics and moving towards decolonizing knowledge. I think that oftentimes in EJ work, as I mentioned at the top, regarding this idea that we're really good at finding damage and finding harm, can we use methods and approaches that are more attuned to the ways in which stories misrepresent what's going on in EJ communities? Yes, we have to document that there's some type of imbalance and inequality regarding exposure and outcome, but is that all of these communities carry with themselves, right? Is that all the our communities have is that one thing? Is there a way that we can engage in storytelling process and data collection, analysis process, and reporting processes that are, more fully capable of honoring what's going on in our communities, right? And then how do we resist commodification of things, right? So big data, machine learning, these large data sets that oftentimes you have to pay for or download from internet with a high-speed internet connection. Like, what are the ways in which we're doing this EJ research, even through a CER, that are prohibitive or inhibitive for a community to actually be able to see themselves in the data or control the data, and the ways in which we're actually making money off the data in the research, right? How can we do better to kind of interrogate those processes and try to disrupt those a bit more going forward, and saying such in the front. I kind of already hit on this a little bit earlier, this idea that needing to pay more attention to power in placemaking, right? Places are made, unmade, and remade all the time. And I think that oftentimes what happens in EJ work for scholars, particularly in public health, that aren't really from the communities or connected to communities in a deeply meaningful way, is very cross-sectional. And it's just looking at relationships between something that exists now and something that exists now. And it doesn't ask the historical context about why either of those things are currently existing, right? And so without situating that historical context and looking at the power relations that precipitated the exposures, it's not really going to help us to disrupt those power relations and dynamics to stop the thing from happening in the present space, or to stop it from happening for another community that is similarly situated in terms of power relations and demographics, XYZ, right? And so I think that that's something that David and I also thought needed a bit more attention and love within the discourse of EJ, even again in community engaged research, because oftentimes, as folks know, especially folks that are familiar with CBPR, it's a spectrum. So there's always room. And then lastly, in terms of, thinking about EJ work going forward, we really wanted to be more expansive about what counts as an exposure. Again, we're so good at finding the harms. Can we find some love? Can we find some joy? Can we find something that is a positive environmental exposure? I realize that we're always going to have to do the work that we have been doing, right, to document the things that are causing harm in our communities. But that's not the only environmental part of our communities, right? So why is it that we have allowed this narrative to take up all the space for environmental justice? I think it's Cornel West's quote, right? Justice is what love looks like in public, or something like that, right? I'm just like, well, can we measure? Can we measure what love looks like? Isn't that an environmental exposure? Isn't happiness and joy and solidarity and resistance an environmental exposure? Isn't that something that we feel and that we embody and that we carry with us, right? And I said it in a general sense, but I also mean it in the literal sense, right? Can we do some of these things? I think that we have to be more intentional about not centering harm and deficits every time we're having an EJ conversation. And in the context of finding things that are causing harm in communities, can we be more expansive in those things, right? So what we lifted up was policing. It's always interesting to me that folks have in the EJ literature have not been necessarily centering racialized police violence and exposure to policing as a daily chronic EJ exposure, right? We know how stress and allostatic load work in public health, especially as social epidemiologists. And so if theoretically, like, police can do whatever they want, whenever they want, however they want, with no consequence, and they're cruising through our neighborhoods or on our corners, or surveillance cameras on every store, on every intersection, that is an exposure that has not been discussed for me at all quite enough, right? Also, the ways in which this contributes to spatial stigma and the idea of spatial stigma itself. Something that we wanted to lift up. And then also thinking about back to this joy and inclusion and healing aspect of environmental exposures, really centering in the value and significance of Indigenous lands for this process, right? And places that are significant beyond just the thing that we're looking for to document harm. So I'm gonna pause for a second, let y'all read that and drink some of this, coffee that I mentioned before. Yeah. All right. So in terms of the methods that we wanted to lift up, Dr. Sarah Commodore and I, in the methods chapter in this book, we went through a gauntlet of these things. It wasn't a short or long chapter, it was just a chapter. But once you start talking about methods, you realize that you need the methods part to probably be an entire book by itself. And once we realized that, we panicked for a minute, and then we just decided, we'll just do what we can do. So we touched on a broad range of methods and methodologies, right? We didn't frame them as being distinct. Oftentimes they're not, and oftentimes they're used together. But we wanted to offer something of an outline of a framework for folks who wanted to have just a general understanding of the methods that are commonly used for CER for EJ. So this includes surveys, environmental monitoring, biomonitoring, big data and small data, community mapping, storytelling, and participatory media and community arts. What I want to talk about here are the ones that I feel personally, and David and I have talked about this, and Sarah and I as well, the ones that are more attuned to and aligned with, anti-racism and decolonizing, right? The ones that are a bit more immersive and allow community residents who are embodying these inequalities and inequities, environmental injustice, to take control of the narrative and do their own thing, right? Versus like things like big data, biomonitoring, and surveys are oftentimes, even if they are tied to a community engaged research process, those methods themselves are a bit distancing. So these are the ones I'll talk about real quick here, and I'll use some examples from my own work that I think do well to illustrate how these things come together, oftentimes overlapping within EJ work. So the first example from a project I did back in Steubenville that I mentioned, in the 6 city studies back in the 70s, that kind of laid some of the groundwork for air quality regulations. Set up a public health training program for youth, scholars, and also intergenerational. So there was youth and parents involved in this work. What you see here is a list of training modules that folks went through to kind of become their own public health researchers for their place-based exposures, environmental exposures. However, they define their exposures, so they chose the exposures they wanted to focus on, and also exposures and opportunities was the lens that we use for this, right? So find the good things, find the things that we want to do something about. And also sometimes we want to do something about the good things too, as in let's get more good things. And I think that this particular project really illustrates how photo voice and counter mapping come together, participatory GIS and quality of GIS come together, and digital storytelling. So photo voice is a key method here. Trained them up, they went out, took photos, upload them to a digital mapping platform that you can see here. On the side here, the Dalton Youth photos. This shaded polygon you see is the census tract according to the government, which you can see when they start talking about their daily place-based exposure and opportunities. A lot of them are outside of their census tract, meaning that a standard process of data analysis that's using government provided data would have missed the reality that a lot of their positive things are actually outside their neighborhood, and then vice versa. A lot of the negative things you can see here from the red markers were inside the neighborhood, right? So we would have a misunderstanding and misrepresentation of their place health experiences from a traditional process, right? Also, you miss topography. Topography is an important environmental aspect, right? And when you're just using flat static maps and GIS layers that don't have topography, you're missing a key part of what's going on in these neighborhood and community environments. And so the red markers again represent some of the negative exposures, and the green markers indicated some of the positive ones. And what we wanted to do with this process was essentially try to decolonize the storytelling process, allow them to engage in their storytelling process through the mapping process, but also through what's going on with their bodies. Oftentimes in place health work and social epi work or EJ work, we take samples from people and analyze them in a lab and then tell the scientific world what's going on. So we disembody the stories of embodiment, which I think is very ironic. And so the X-ray mapping methodology that we used was like a counter narrative. To tell the story of embodiment through a way that allowed them to tell the stories of what's going on in their bodies in these places by just using color-coded stickers that indicate for each of these markers on the map what their bodies experience from their own perceptions when they're in those locations. And then turning them into infographics. That was an idea of one of the researchers to be able to also digitally map these as a part of the storytelling process. And I will say this in this particular context, in this story, that prior to engaging in this work, having come from this community, lived in this community, it was very clear there's a historic pattern of exclusion and misrepresentation. And to the point where one of the adult participants in the work had a concern that basically they said it's like the city, like they want to wipe us off the map. And I thought that was very fitting for this particular project, especially in the context of the health department not doing health data specifically for any one community, but aggregating it for the entire city so that nobody can know what's going on in their own community because they don't even track the data. And then also because urban planning, the city planning department at the time had just recently released a report about this particular community and other neighborhoods within the city and came to the conclusion that it lacked a sense of place. And come to find out they had never talked to anybody who actually lived in the community, right? And so for us, this is an opportunity to actually offer a counter narrative and do a counter story project using some of the methods that are aligned with these principles of CER and EJ. Similar project, taking that same type of training process and bringing it here to Portland, Oregon, where I'm at now. And expanding upon and continuing it, again, photo voice and counter mapping, participatory GIS and qualitative GIS, also creative arts and storytelling as a part of this process. So doing the embodiment mapping, the positive negative locations of embodiment, but then also continuing the X-ray mapping aspect of this, and then engaging research arts, right? So the tele stories and counter stories through that can lift up more room for the positive aspects and themes of resistance through creative arts, right? So we design, zines like chapbook type things, buttons and pins that be printed out, and then also youth design their hoodies, sweatshirts with some research data quotes from the research that we put on the hoodies that we never get around to because the pandemic had to shut down the project, right? But the idea was that we can actually take this research and this data and we can push it back out into the community or share it back out into the community in a way that is a bit different than what we're traditionally used to seeing in EJ related work. And then another version of this project expanded a bit more to further align with creative arts and counter storytelling, right? Weaving in poetry, right? The ways in which we can use poetry and creative arts to tell stories about what's going on in communities, right? And so I think that I'm a poet and I'm a social epidemiologist and I'm and I think in EJ research, oftentimes we think it's a very like discrete one thing. And I think by restricting the expansiveness or our own creativity and our own humanity by leaving the creative arts out, I think we restrict and limit our ability to actually reach the folks who might be moved into action by a different form of storytelling. And so I think that poetry for me is one of those ways in which it's always going to be in my toolkit. So that's something that we did with this work is that we added a poetry component to it and a geopoem project where the youth researchers would write poems about some of their data points and then record their reading of those poems on the spot of that location, right? And this work is still in process. And then lastly here, as I try to close out and wrap up, stay on time, a recent project working with folks that are inside Oregon State Penitentiary as a part of a Black Studies class that is themed around abolition and memory and place in Black Portland. Having a chance to train up some of the folks inside on poetry and photo voice and training in photography, and then working with students who are recently returned home that are part of the Project Rebound project here at Portland State University to do a photo voice project, the inside outside photo voice project, where the recently returned students were taking the photos based on the locations determined by the folks that are inside, and then bringing those photos back in so they can complete their photo voice project, and then also write poems about those locations. And so being able to have a photo, a story about the photo, and a poem about the photo, and then put this all on a digital map as a storytelling process is something that is able to tell a story about these environmental exposures, particularly in the context of racialized policing and abolition and anti-Blackness and the spatial element of EJ, right? I mentioned before, policing is a core environmental justice exposure that I just feel like doesn't really get traction in some of these conversations. And I feel like this project really allowed us to engage in that in a way that was holding all the things. So it was holding the joy and the love, the good memories of this intersection, but also the ways in which this intersection is a space of harm, right? But there's so much more to it. And I think if we don't allow folks to tell that story, all we're going to get from our data sets is the part that we're trained to find, which is the damage, right? And so the geopoem and the photo voice allow for a more expansive and generative conversation that I think aligns with counter storytelling, also counter mapping. And this is a couple examples of the maps that they did. And we also created playlists. So each of the students created playlists that they thought aligned with their stories that they're telling based on these places. And you can actually scan that QR code and find an aggregate playlist that's kind of like an abolition themed playlist from the class. And I think that's it. There's the book again. You can scan that and get yourself a copy or get yourself another copy, get a copy for a friend and a neighbor or a homie, do what you do. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much to the three presenters. And Dr. Pettaway, we did not know you were from Steubenville. We would have led with that, of course, for the folks who are in the Ohio folks who are in the audience. I did want to, while folks are populating the Q&A box, I wanted to kick off with a question. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the body geography methodology that you were using. Could you just talk a little bit more about the genesis of that? If you've seen it used in other places, I just thought that was a really cool participatory research method that I'm not familiar with at all in the way that I've heard of and applied photo voice or some of the other things that you were talking about that were more participatory.
Yeah, for sure. So I first started engaging in that method with based on collaboration I had with a friend and co-conspirator homie, Dr. Jessica Ruglis, who's at McGill University in Montreal. She was doing her postdoc at Hopkins when I was working down at the health department. And it was a methodology that she developed to use based on other body mapping methodologies that are in the women and gender studies, anthropology literatures, right? Something that she developed and tweaked to use within schools, public schools particularly, to kind of capture the effects of schooling on our bodies. We think about, as a public health person and social ethic, we think about education as like an attainment thing, like you get more education and you have better health. What she was focusing on this work and bringing that methodology in was, what does schooling do to ourselves, to our bodies, right? So what is it like? What do we feel when we have to walk through metal detectors, to have no soap in our bathrooms in schools, to have no toilet paper, to have rats in our schools, to be exposed to these chemicals that we're smelling, right? So what does it do? What does schooling as itself do to us as a process of embodiment in an EJ exposure context too, of course? And so what I did was basically extend a methodology to make it more spatialized and place-based. Because I think that in the EJ exposure context and community engaged research context, as a place health scholar, we don't live and stay in one place 24/7 every day, right? We are mobile, right? Our place is places. And so if we're only thinking about our neighborhoods, people say neighborhoods are, and then that's separate from like our school and that's separate from our work. They're all connected. We embody and kind of internalize the social and the more physical. So it's air quality or noise, or if it's just like discrimination, we're taking that in everywhere we go. And I thought this methodology, the X-ray mapping, was really good to allow folks to capture their exposures, their perceptions of how those various exposures are landing on their bodies in each place. So we can have a multi-spatial element aspect of environmental justice and embodiment.
I will echo what Dr. Hancock said about this presentation. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I have a question about community engaged research in your experience, and this is a question for all three of you, in your experience, what would you say are some pitfalls that scholars must avoid when trying to do community engaged research, because they might be trying to do something good and have research that is informed by the community, but then inadvertently end up causing harm. So, what is your take on how well-intended, community-intended research might cause harm, and what are some ways we can avoid that?
I'm happy to go first, and while other people are thinking, we actually had a chapter on thinking about this from the beginning. And so I'm just going to share with that slide just real quick, because Martha was very prescient and said, let's make sure we get this slide in. I think one of the important things that we can do as academic researchers when we get ready to prepare ourselves to go in and do this kind of work is to ask how power relations, four kinds of power relations, might interact with the community. And part of that is thinking about our own individual positionality, our ascribed characteristics like race and gender, but also achieved ones like education, and how that might generate friction with the community, and what we need to, the kind of self-work that we need to do before we go into a community collaboration. Some of that has to do about thinking about our disciplines and how they might be seen in the community. Anthropologists have a lot to overcome, a lot of history to overcome to earn the trust of indigenous communities. And some anthropologists know that, and they're really good at doing it. Public health. And some of it is institutional. How's your university seen, for example? What history has it had, for example, in gentrifying the community? Or what are the attractions of your university? And here, you might be surprised. There are folks in EJ communities who would, like to get tickets to the football games, to your university's football games. And hey, if that helps build a bridge, great. Let's start there. And then some of them are project related. What are the initial thoughts that you're coming in with about, especially your definition of the community, and how might that be a partial understanding of it, and how might that need to change? So I think avoiding harm and figuring out ways to anticipate that begins with researchers preparing themselves to go do this work. But I wonder, maybe Martha and Ryan want to talk about some of the other stages in, for example, managing conflict with community-based organizations and other steps and stages that they've taken.
Thanks. I think Ryan, probably I'm going to turn to you next, because I think you have a really good way of talking about this. But I would say that, thank you, Chad. That chapter about preparing yourselves is really useful. It was written by Floriboj Lopez in Los Angeles, who's in Chicano studies at UCLA. Really brought kind of to the fore sort of the need to be really conscious, right? About your positionality, about power, about privileges, about relations, relative to where you come from, et cetera, your knowledge of place, experiences, et cetera. And it's I learned a tremendous amount from her. Some of what I think we have to do as researchers is unlearn some of the things, right? I mean, there's our book argues, there's a shifting paradigm around how we think about research, right? And Ryan gave really good examples of like what is needed to actually do and strive for and drive environmental justice if you're a researcher. And so I think unlearning is an important piece of recognizing, well, let me just say, it's not unlearning. We're going to use the tools, right? And we're going to think about the dominant kind of research paradigm, and then think about how community engaged research, right, provides a different kind of research approach, different set of relationships, a different set of research practices and methodologies, right? We have to be able to be conscious about how what the limitations of the traditional research are and what community engaged research actually can provide us, right? Deep listening is really a key here. I I think I will just say my own personal experience, right? Coming up in the EJ movement, I've been schooled over and over by people, right? About how to align some of the research, how to align some of how we talk about our conditions with sort of collective movements of people, right? And it's a practice that I think Ryan talked about a little bit, but it's a practice that needs to kind of get engaged in sort of the community engaged research process that that goes back to the initial kind of piece of, deep listening and deep commitment to relational aspects of the work. Ryan.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, all of that. I think the only thing I would add is I think oftentimes when I think about doing this work, whatever it looks like from whatever lane, right? I realize that not everyone is, I think that Chad and Martha, you both pointed this out, like not everyone is doing EJ related work is doing CER, and everyone's doing CER doesn't look the same. And so I think that in various disciplines, right? And so I think the thing that always comes into my mind about this and how to do this well or try to do it better, it's hard for me to not center those power relations from the very beginning. And core to those power relations is oftentimes the institutions that employ the researchers with the capital R or in quotes or whatever, they require us to participate in their power structure, which means that we have to get grants and bring them money and indirect fees, and indirect costs and things of that nature, right? And then grants are funded on a timeline, like 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, right? So there's a certain element of coercion that influences a lot of the work that is done, especially in the public health lane, right? I don't think you would find anyone that would disagree with that. Like it's a coercive power imbalance environment to do this work. And sometimes it's at a pace or at a sacrifice of certain things that are that are not conducive to building trust and rapport with EJ communities. And so I think that for me, sometimes I think I'd like to have us spend more time thinking about how we can shift, how we incentivize what happens in academia such that we can be better partners. Because like as an individual, I can only be the partner that I can be based on whether my institution is looking at me sideways. Like you need to get us more grant money. Or you need to get more papers out sooner. When I'm like, listen, like I just got this grant because I had to wait 2 or 3 years to build a relationship where we collaboratively got a grant, and now we're going to do the thing. And now the first paper comes out 6 years later, right? So I think that we have to really fundamentally push back on that. I think there's an element of environmental justice work when there's an academic partner involved that we can't be the better versions of ourselves if we're not addressing that. So I think that sometimes well-intentioned, dope scholars, dope community scholars, scholars that are activists, scholars that are trained in community organizing that know the things, and yet they're still constrained by the structure. And I think that poses a problem.
Yeah, there's been a lot of important work done also to educate IRBs, institutional review boards, and human subjects committees to adjust their criteria and their understanding, particularly the role of community researchers who are co-researchers, not research subjects, and therefore need to be thought about and treated very differently. And so there's important work also that's talked about in the book about reforming IRBs. And then also community advisory boards, having real meaningful power sharing in community advisory boards that oversee projects, and even bringing them into institutions, universities, to help decide what kind of projects get funded and how much. I think that's also important work and ways of addressing some of these conflicts and potential harms. I saw there was also a question about how do we navigate different types and definitions of community engaged research. Just real briefly, I think one example of that is the transition from people talking about citizen science to community science. It's not just a shift in nomenclature to be less exclusive by using the word citizen to do research with lots of people who don't always have citizenship status. It's also about shifting from that original citizen science approach, which a lot of those studies were basically crowdsourcing data collection by community members to serve the beast of a study that was designed by academic experts for their interests, and shifting that much more towards the kind of work we've been talking about, where the community defines the research agenda, and the knowledge is co-produced and not simply community members feeding in data points to a study that was designed by an academic scientist. So I think that's really important to look closely at the practice of this work and not just the name that somebody's putting on it to maybe make it look good. that person also wanted to hear more about integrating art, music, and poetry into community engaged practice, which I think is Ryan's expertise. So I don't know if Ryan, if you want to add any more on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that man, it's bizarre that we have to ask these questions. Like I know we have to, right? But it's like I don't know. Like it's like I think a lot of us is intuitive. Like, oh, how come we're not doing that? How come that hasn't been here in this conversation? And I do think I will say that even in the chapter we mentioned this, there are examples of EJ work where folks are engaging creative arts and participatory media, right? Um, yeah, I think that if we're trying to center community voice and experience, for me at least, as a public health person, I always say that like I was listening to music and writing poems and doing freestyle battles before I could even pronounce the word epidemiology, and so I understood a lot about the world before I got a degree to show that I understood something about the world. And I think that we start there with all of our research and think about the ways in which we can open a conversation, um, not with the thing that creates distance between us and EJ communities, but the thing that connects us, and is not, running regressions don't connect us, sampling techniques and procedures don't connect us, right? I think that we can think about the stories that we want to tell to surface what's going on in communities and the ways in which knowledge is shared and communicated within generations and across generations. I think if we start there, I think what we'll find is that it's going to be through some type of creative art or some form of storytelling that we didn't need our degrees to really have those conversations with and through. And so um, I always suggest that I try to always take an intergenerational approach, and I always try to center arts. And so I think that there are examples out there, in public health. There aren't very many, but I think in the EJ subdisciplines there's more examples. So anybody that's thinking about doing work collaboratively with community, in community, I don't know, do a little research on like what is the currency, the artistic currency within those spaces and those communities, right? And partnering and funding and paying community artists to be a part of the work, not just on the back end when you got to do a dissemination thing and you want to do a mural or some t-shirts, but like how can you actually collaborate with artists in the front end, right? I think that that's always a good start, and that's what I try to do. But again, back to the funding thing, it's kind of hard to do that. Sometimes it's not seen as integral to advancing the knowledge and the science, or that, as Chad mentioned earlier, this idea of rigor. Do we throw that word away because it's like a visceral reaction for a lot of folks, including myself, or do we try to reclaim it, right? I think art is always in that space where it's like it's cute. You can do that over there, but that's not the real science. It's not the real knowledge, right? And of course, as a poet who published peer-reviewed poems in public health journals, like poetry is science and knowledge, right? But to make that argument to a funder is a bit more challenging, right? So I think that how do we move what we already know about art and how important it is for our resistance and our survival's always been there for us. Every movement has had a soundtrack and a poet and a play, right? Everything. There's not an EJ rally out there that doesn't have music, like, so we're fooling ourselves that we don't think it's necessary, but how do we be able to move forward in a way that we're getting artists and community collaborators who are creatives paid to support this work?
Yeah. So another question about repeated incidents at Columbus auto shredding. We know most of these areas were intentionally segregated. How do you educate the community about the harm? What about reparations for the damage? And that got me thinking about a campaign that was run by Environmental Health Coalition in San Diego over at least a decade, that was also looking at the impact of metal shops. And so please feel free to email me if you want some background information on that. But I think they might be a great source to turn to, because they is a primarily Latino neighborhood, Latinx neighborhood, and so they drew on the tradition of healthcare promotoras. So they worked with and trained local women to work with the community, not just to educate them, but to learn from the community, right, about what the impacts were on them, and then to develop municipal ordinance to transition some of those auto shops out of the community without damaging, the livelihoods of the people who are working at them. So happy to share some resources on that if it would be helpful. Also noticed there was a very deep question about how can community engaged researchers critically examine and potentially reframe the notion of harm itself, challenging the assumption that harm can be objectively measured or eliminated, while navigating the complex interplay between documenting systemic oppression, avoiding damage-centered narratives, and authentically representing diverse community perspectives. without inadvertently reinforcing power imbalances or paternalistic notions of empowerment. That's a lot to think about. Any thoughts about how CER researchers can critically examine and potentially reframe this notion of harm?
Martha, did you want
No, I was gonna,
to?
to you, Brian, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna. That's like a qualifying exam question. That's like I have to prove myself to get a PhD, so I got to sit in this room for 4 hours and answer this question. It really is. It's a great question. It really is. I do, and I don't have an answer. I have a response. I do think that um, it's tough because like we know that communities are continuing to embody these consequences of these environmental injustices, right? And I will say, as somebody who doesn't believe that the math is going to save us or regressions are going to like change the world, I think EJ exposures is one of those fields where like we actually still need that quant, that heavy quant. We have to measure this and measure that, right? Especially at like local levels, right? Like you can't, if you don't have, you can't show there's something in the water and there's something in the body, then like you have nothing here. Versus these other things where it's like segregation, like that's very like, like so I think that there are certain ways in which EJ exposure science particularly is very much always going to be finding those things. And so in terms of harm in that sense, I think that we have to continue doing that, right? I guess for me, it's about how do we do that alongside of the more part, right? There's more to us, there's more with us, right? How can we surface those narratives and those stories? Because I think that's how we avoid the power imbalances, right? That's how we avoid the spatial stigma. That's how we avoid the erasures and the epistemic violence that often characterize environmental justice research. Because if we see ourselves in what's published, all we see is what's wrong with us, right? And so that's where the additional harm comes from, right? Like it's like you're talking about me, but you don't even know me. Like all you know is that like there's just something in my air here, and that's it. And that's the only story that folks outside of my community will ever hear about my community. And I think that's the problem. And I think that that's what we have to wrestle with, right? It's like under what context do we create these stories of harm and share them? And are we mindful of the ways in which that might be the only story that anybody ever hears about Flint or Steubenville or fence line communities, right? Because folks inside know that there's more, but the folks that we have to prove ourselves to as scientists don't. And so I think that's where we have to be very intentional and mindful with our stories and narratives going forward.
I think that's a great answer. And it starts with just asking the community, how do you frame harm? I was thinking about the study that UC Berkeley School of Public Health did in San Francisco, Chinese restaurants, about 15 years ago, where they came in thinking, we're going to do a study on occupational safety and health in Chinese restaurants. So they were thinking about things like cuts and burns. And then they started doing community engaged research with Chinese Progressive Association and with people who were working in those restaurants. And they said, what's really the biggest causes of harm? Lack of healthcare coverage and wage theft. That's what's really harming us here. And so they really broadened the scope of the study. And that ended up with a very important municipal ordinance that was passed, anti-wage theft ordinance, that probably ended up having a much bigger response to what was actually happening in that community and a bigger impact on ameliorating it than simply figuring out ways for people to avoid cuts and burns, in kitchens.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think these are really great, really amazing questions and really great answers. I did want to introduce, because I'm watching the time too, sort of this idea about community organizing and power building. And so, Chad and I was just context of the book, we grappled with this because we wrote a big chapter on community organizing as an application of community engaged research. And it was big and, really important, but we didn't have space in the book to put it. So we published it in a different journal, but it really does get at this idea that, combining organizing with community knowledge is necessary to change the power dynamics, right, that are creating conditions in places and required for putting out a new narrative, right? So there was an earlier question about reparations. How do you get reparations for some of this thing, right? If you think about the reparations in a polity context, right? There is, you know, we need great power to be able to push our decision makers to actually move the needle on that, right? We need, the folks in San Diego had to organize all the promotoras who were both on one hand collecting information and community knowledge about what was happening in their neighborhoods around some of these metal plating places, and organizing them to actually show up at in City Hall to give testimonies, right? And they had to show up in decision makers' office. They had to go do protests in front of, you know, their city council members' homes, etc. But that organizing strategy has to be really clear and connected deeply with the community engaged research in order to actually address some of the conditions and or recognize the truths of folks on the ground. So want to just kind of make sure that we don't leave this webinar today without talking about the power of community organizing.
And you're muted, Dr. Hancock.
My apologies. I was so caught up in Martha, what you were just saying about lifting up community organizing. If you would please join me, audience, in thanking Dr. Martha Matsuoka, Dr. Chad Raphael, and Dr. Ryan Pettaway. Please, please, please. This has been recorded, and we will have this up on our Vimeo page. So again, if you know of folks who want to see and want to learn more about this, we encourage you to be able to share this with them so they can download the book and they can be able to get access to it. Also want to welcome any and all of you to our next session, which will be next Thursday, November 7th, where we will be celebrating a second book. That book is entitled Welcome the Wretched, and it was authored by our Ohio State colleague, literally across the street, Professor Cesar Cuauhtemoc Garcia Hernandez. And he's a scholar and a professor in the Moritz College of Law here at The Ohio State University. So since immigration, again, has been so much a part of what we have been hearing about and talking about for the past year and the past cycle, I think, you know, Professor Garcia Hernandez definitely offers a different take that is worth exploring. So please do join us for that. That will go back to being in hybrid format. But again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Dr. Matsuoka, Dr. Raphael, Dr. Pettaway. And again, the name of the book is Ground Truths. So please do use it in good health. I say that with a little bit of quotation marks around it, given what Dr. Pettaway was talking about. But again, the idea here is to make sure that this gets out as free and as far and wide as possible. So thank you again. So thank you all. So good to see you.
Ange-Marie. Great to see
Really,
you.
really appreciate it. Ryan, if you're ever in the area, please do, you know, swing by and visit. I know Columbus and Steubenville aren't exactly close, but, you know.
90 minutes, you know, it's close enough.
Yeah, I mean, you could fly into Columbus and then drive down to Steubenville, you know, so especially from the West Coast. But in any case, no, we're very, this has been wonderful. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Great to
Thank
see
you.
you, Brian. Thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.